It was not a single defeat, not a single battle, and not a single enemy that destroyed Napoleon Bonaparte's empire. It was one catastrophic moment where ambition finally collided with reality. For over a decade, Europe trembled at his name. Kings fell, borders vanished, and entire nations were reshaped by his will. Napoleon was not just a general, he was a force of nature, a man who believed destiny itself had chosen him to rule the continent. Yet one battle shattered that illusion forever. What happened on that frozen battlefield did more than defeat an army. It broke the backbone of an empire and turned the most powerful man in Europe into a hunted exile. This is the story of the battle that destroyed Napoleon's empire. By the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the absolute peak of human power. No European leader in centuries had risen so fast or reshaped the political map so completely. France, once weakened by revolution and internal chaos, had become the dominant military force on the continent under his command. Through brilliance, speed, and ruthless efficiency, Napoleon crushed coalition after coalition. Austria, Prussia, and Russia had all tasted defeat. His armies marched under the belief that they were invincible, fueled by victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram. Napoleon did not merely win wars. He rewrote how wars were fought. He centralized command, moved armies faster than any opponent, and struck with precision that stunned Europe's old monarchies. By 1811, his empire stretched from Spain to the borders of Russia, and from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. It was an empire built on conquest, intimidation, and the personal genius of one man. Yet beneath this image of unstoppable power, cracks were already forming. Napoleon's empire was vast, but it was fragile. It relied on constant victory to survive. Every conquered nation needed troops to occupy it, administrators to govern it, and resources to exploit it. Resistance simmered everywhere. In Spain, guerrilla warfare drained French manpower and morale. In Germany and Italy, nationalism quietly grew stronger with every French decree. Napoleon believed he could control Europe through fear and economic pressure, particularly through his continental system, designed to strangle Britain by cutting off trade. Instead, it backfired. Smuggling flourished, allies grew resentful, and even France's own economy suffered. The emperor responded not with compromise, but with force, pushing his armies deeper into hostile territory. The greatest mistake of all was Russia. Tsar Alexander I had once been Napoleon's ally, but the alliance was built on convenience, not trust. As Russia drifted away from the continental system, Napoleon saw defiance where he demanded obedience. To him, allowing Russia to ignore his commands would unravel the authority he had built across Europe. In 1812, he made a decision that would define his downfall. He would invade Russia and force the Tsar into submission. It was a gamble, driven by pride, overconfidence, and a belief that his past victories guaranteed future success. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men drawn from across his empire. French soldiers marched alongside Germans, Italians, Poles, and reluctant allies who fought not for France, but because they had no choice. From the very beginning, the invasion revealed how vulnerable Napoleon's system truly was. The Grand Army was massive, but it was also slow, overstretched, and dependent on supply lines that grew longer with every step eastward. The Russians refused to fight the decisive battle Napoleon desired. Instead, they retreated deeper into their vast territory, burning crops and villages behind them. This scorched earth strategy denied the French food, shelter, and resources. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion began killing soldiers faster than Russian bullets. Napoleon pressed on, convinced that one great battle would end everything, just as it always had before. When that battle finally came near Borodino, it was one of the bloodiest single days of combat in European history. Tens of thousands died, and yet the result was indecisive. The Russian army withdrew again, battered but unbroken. Napoleon entered Moscow expecting surrender. Instead, he found a city abandoned and soon engulfed in flames. There was no peace offer, no triumphant conclusion, only a ruined capital that could not sustain his army. As winter approached, reality closed in. Napoleon waited too long, hoping the Tsar would bend. He underestimated Russia's will, its climate, and its sheer size. When the retreat finally began, it was a nightmare beyond anything Europe had ever witnessed. Freezing temperatures, constant attacks, starvation, and disease destroyed the Grand Army. By the time the survivors staggered back across the borders, Napoleon's aura of invincibility was gone. Europe watched in disbelief as the emperor returned with only a fraction of the force he had taken into Russia. The Russian disaster did not just weaken France militarily, it exposed Napoleon as human. His enemies sensed opportunity. Prussia rose in rebellion. Austria switched sides. Britain increased its support for any coalition willing to fight. The balance of power shifted almost overnight. Napoleon still had skill, still had determination, but he no longer had limitless resources or unquestioned loyalty. His empire had been built through fear and victory, and now both were fading. The battlefields that once brought him glory would soon bring him ruin, culminating in a final confrontation that would destroy not only his army but his empire itself. After the catastrophe in Russia, Napoleon faced a reality he had never truly known before, fighting a defensive war for survival rather than an offensive war for domination. For the first time, Europe was no longer reacting to him, it was actively uniting against him. The Sixth Coalition formed with a determination fueled by years of humiliation and fear. Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, Sweden, and a growing list of German states aligned with a single purpose: to end Napoleon's rule forever. What made this coalition different from all previous ones was experience. These nations had learned from their defeats. They no longer sought glory in single decisive engagements with Napoleon himself. Instead, they aimed to exhaust his forces, isolate him, and strike at his empire, piece by piece. Napoleon, meanwhile, worked with astonishing speed to rebuild an army. In a matter of months, France raised hundreds of thousands of new soldiers. But these were not the hardened veterans of Austerlitz or Jena. They were young, poorly trained conscripts, boys who marched with courage but lacked experience. The emperor still possessed his strategic brilliance, but his human tools were weaker than ever. His cavalry was depleted, his artillery horses scarce, and his officer corps thinned by years of relentless warfare. Yet Napoleon believed that speed, maneuver, and his personal command could still overcome numerical inferiority and declining quality. It was a belief that had saved him many times before. The campaign of 1813 unfolded across Central Europe, with Germany becoming the decisive battleground. Early engagements showed flashes of Napoleon's old genius. He won tactical victories, outmaneuvered enemy formations, and proved that he was still one of the greatest commanders who had ever lived. But every victory cost him men he could not replace, while his enemies could draw on vast reserves. The coalition adopted a new strategy known as the Trachenberg Plan, which avoided direct confrontation with Napoleon himself while targeting his marshals and supply lines. It was a strategy designed not to beat Napoleon in battle, but to bleed his empire dry. As summer turned to autumn, the pressure intensified. Napoleon found himself increasingly isolated, forced to respond to multiple threats at once. His allies deserted him one by one. German states that had once marched proudly under French banners now turned their guns against him. The ideological spell of the French Revolution had faded, replaced by rising nationalism and resentment toward foreign rule. Napoleon was no longer seen as a liberator, he was viewed as an occupier. Every mile of territory he lost weakened his political authority and emboldened his enemies. All roads led to Leipzig. In October 1813, near the city of Leipzig in Saxony, the largest battle Europe had ever witnessed began to take shape. It would later be known as the Battle of Nations. More than 500,000 soldiers from nearly every major European power converged on a single region. Napoleon commanded roughly 200,000 men, while the coalition forces exceeded 300,000 and continued to grow as reinforcements arrived. The battlefield was vast, chaotic, and unforgiving. Rivers, villages, and marshland turned maneuver into a nightmare. For 4 days, from October 16 to October 19, Europe erupted into violence on an unprecedented scale. Napoleon fought with the desperation of a man who understood what was at stake. He launched attacks designed to break the coalition's center, hoping to force a negotiated peace before his enemies could fully coordinate their overwhelming numbers. For moments, it seemed possible. French artillery thundered, infantry advanced with discipline, and Napoleon personally directed movements with relentless focus. But the coalition commanders held firm. They absorbed losses, rotated fresh troops into the fight, and slowly tightened the noose. As the days passed, the numerical imbalance became impossible to ignore. Napoleon's army was being crushed not by incompetence, but by sheer weight. The decisive blow came when Napoleon's lines of retreat were compromised. Bridges were destroyed too early, communication broke down, and panic spread among exhausted troops. As French units attempted to withdraw, chaos erupted. Soldiers drowned trying to cross rivers, artillery was abandoned, and entire formations collapsed. Worst of all, several of Napoleon's former allies switched sides mid-battle, turning their weapons against the French. The psychological impact was devastating. What had once been an empire united by fear and loyalty now disintegrated in front of him. Leipzig was not just a defeat, it was a public execution of Napoleon's authority in Germany. When the battle ended, Napoleon retreated west with a shattered army. The loss at Leipzig destroyed the French position in Central Europe entirely. Germany was gone, Poland was lost, the Rhine stood exposed. For the first time, enemy armies prepared to invade France itself. Napoleon's empire beyond its borders collapsed almost overnight. His enemies no longer feared him, they believed he could be beaten, and they were determined to prove it. The final phase of Napoleon's downfall was brutal, personal, and inevitable. In 1814, coalition armies crossed into France from multiple directions. This was no longer a war for influence, it was a war to remove Napoleon from power. Despite overwhelming odds, Napoleon fought with astonishing resilience. The campaign of France showcased some of his most brilliant tactical maneuvers. Outnumbered, outgunned, and constantly pressured, he moved rapidly between enemy armies, striking unexpectedly and achieving a series of sharp victories. These battles demonstrated that his genius had not vanished, but brilliance could not compensate for reality. France was exhausted, its population was tired of endless war, its economy strained, and its allies gone. Paris became the ultimate target. As coalition forces closed in, political support for Napoleon crumbled. Senators, ministers, and generals who once owed everything to him now considered survival more important than loyalty. When Paris fell in March 1814, the war was effectively over. Napoleon abdicated the throne shortly afterward. The man who had crowned himself emperor, who had commanded Europe, was exiled to the small island of Elba. His empire, built through years of bloodshed and ambition, collapsed with stunning speed, yet even exile could not extinguish Napoleon's belief in destiny. In 1815, he escaped Elba and returned to France, launching the dramatic episode known as the 100 Days. For a brief moment, history seemed to rewind. Soldiers rallied to him, crowds cheered, and the old magic flickered once more. But Europe was ready. The coalition mobilized instantly, determined to end Napoleon once and for all. There would be no second chance, no negotiation, no mercy. The final battle came at Waterloo. Unlike Leipzig, this was not a clash of empires across continents, but it was no less decisive. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced British and Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington, with Prussian reinforcements racing toward the battlefield. Rain-soaked ground slowed French attacks. Delays compounded mistakes. For the first time in his career, Napoleon's timing failed him. When the Prussians arrived, the balance shifted irreversibly. The French army collapsed under combined pressure. Waterloo ended not just a campaign, but an era. After his final defeat, Napoleon surrendered to the British. This time, there would be no escape. He was sent to the remote island of St. Helena, thousands of miles from Europe. There, isolated and watched constantly, he lived out his remaining years reflecting on glory and failure. The empire he had built was dismantled. Monarchies were restored. Borders were redrawn. Europe sought stability after decades of war unleashed by one man's ambition. The battle that destroyed Napoleon's empire was not defined by a single location alone. It was the culmination of hubris, exhaustion, resistance, and unity against domination. From the frozen plains of Russia to the fields of Leipzig and finally the mud of Waterloo, Napoleon's downfall reshaped Europe forever. His legacy remains paradoxical, both tyrant and reformer, conqueror and visionary. But one truth stands above all others. When his empire fell, it proved that even the greatest military genius in history could not conquer reality itself.